Thank you once again. An urban response to post-pandemic world. So whilst the pandemic as a topic has overwhelmed the news, shall we say, we also need to examine some of its effects and its long-term impacts, some of which are potentially life-changing, certainly as far as cities are concerned. So it's the global response to a post-pandemic world. Large, dense, and sprawling. Cities are a necessity. Cities are good for us. They offer us employment, choices, variety, hope, and prosperity. We are social beings, and cities are a great human invention. So we need them. But cities are responsive. They respond to our needs and they respond to our fears. They usually come about, or historically, as a form of protection. They protect us against loneliness. They protect us against potential, once we're in crowds, enemies and exterior groups will think twice about attacking us. Therefore, cities are as old as human societies themselves. So what are the changes and what are the evolution of the cities? As far as security, which is a very base and primary requirements and characteristic of cities is concerned, they have sort of demonstrated or have shown themselves in different ways. I mean, the walls around most medieval historical cities is an obvious one, but cities being built on the side of mountains so that the roads are as complicated, as cumbersome as possible, so that potential armies of attacking armies could be targeted, etc. But cities get regulated, and we need regulation for human societies, but we need regulations for a functioning city. And laws are often a response to fear. The apocalyptic predictions of what could happen, fire, theft, vandalism, and the need for protection. Urban regulations, believe it or not, are one form of a response to disease and disasters, and they are the consequences of them. So I'm just reading from my note. Disasters, or more accurately, the fear of them, shape our cities. And you may know of 1666 Great Fire of London, where it started in a bakery and spread across the, what was then the centre of London, the city of London, and destroyed well over 2/3 of it. Now, because of that, the city started redesigning and replanning itself. And in many ways, they say that what we know as city regulations or building codes was a direct result of what happened, let's say, about 400 years ago. That cities need to be, or buildings and streets would need a certain code and materiality, etc., to protect us, to protect the city and its longevity. But if cities are, by definition, places of dense human habitation, then density is an inescapable reality. Now, one of the issues that we've all heard in the last 4, 5, 6 months is the fact that COVID epidemic is a sort of has heightened our awareness about human proximity. So people, you know, obviously we've all heard of social distancing, in a sense that how close we are to each other and how close we function together becomes an issue that COVID and COVID protection demands us to observe. So the need to separate ourselves, or the need to define ourselves, are in-between spaces in relation to what it is now, COVID-19, highlights a number of questions that I would like us to think about, even at this hour of the evening, as predominantly as urbanists or planners and so on. Densification, again, many urbanists have long argued that dense urban centers are more efficient in their functionality and land usage. Or building a city inwardly offers an approach to housing demands and reduces the tendency of cities to spread out and claim precious lands. You can see that smaller countries have this problem, a greater problem than larger countries, but even the large countries, again, 15, 20 years ago, when the sustainability argument was being urged, the American cities, or shall we say the in West Coast American cities, where the urbanization programs sometimes meant that 4,000 or 5,000 houses were built in a 2-3 hours drive from any city. That in itself was deemed as an unsustainable form of creating human living. So even large countries find that, or urban, you know, that thing a problem. So it's obviously called urban sprawl. Everyone's heard of that. Again, the cheaper land that sort of is out in the desert creates opportunities. It gives us greater spaces, bigger parks, you know, cheaper housing, etc. But within it, inherently there are issues, and that's the issues of city connectivity. So we started by saying cities, by definition, need to be close or dense so that they can function better. But then if you then begin to create a disparate sort of range of habitation, then by definition that concept is challenged. So the debate, again, urbanists have had for decades is density versus sprawl. And there's a lot of data out there, a lot of statistics. Where lies the balance? These are some data from London School of Economics that was done, I think it's 2016, if I remember correctly. Now, London, in terms of person per kilometer squared, is about 27,000, just over 27,000. But New York, you can see it's almost double at 59,000. And Hong Kong is almost double that at 1,100,000. That's person per kilometer square. And these are just 3 examples of large cities, but by no means that is the most dense. I mean, again, if memory serves me, Mumbai is 127,000 sort of population per kilometer square. So you can see that in a city like London, which is a collection of small villages, and that gradually have grown together to form a metropolis, has a sort of a greater room for, let's say, personal spaces. There are greater number of individual houses, but that scenario is changing as, again, the city is stopping itself from growing physically, yet the population and the need for individual units grows over time. We just mentioned some very well-known and well-documented cities, and these are by and large advanced economies. Now, on the fringes of nearly every city in the world, some worse than others, obviously, on the fringes of cities, under the underbelly of the gray areas, are the unaccounted for, those that are sort of there in reality, but by data or on paper, they are not being recorded. These are slum dwellers, and many cities have them. They contribute to the economy, they are part of the city, and yet they have huge shortages in terms of standards of decent human habitation. This is the favela of Rio de Janeiro. Again, you've heard, and many people know of it. It's a sort of started around sort of mid to late 19th century. It was temporarily an army sort of housing scheme, and then gradually grew and grew and grew, and it's grown to extent that it's become a completely flourishing at one level, yet fraught with all sorts of social problems from the other. Now, in another talk I do on urban sprawl, there is an aerial photograph that shows how the edges of the green belt, if you like, is gradually being overtaken by these shanty towns and so on. So there are all sorts of environmental issues, as well as sort of the fact that the quality of living is substandard, as well as the slums, if you like. There are the war zones, and war zones, a bit like COVID, doesn't know rich or poor. Potentially any city could fall into that trap. You just have to be unlucky and be in an unstable part of the world, and before you know it, you're engulfed by the destructive fire of war. Again, one might argue that, okay, against the global context, cities that are affected by wars, and now there are not that many of them. But I'd like to propose to you that, because as again we consider societies, any urbanist would need to look at the construct of a society and human condition as a whole. And once you do that, you see that wars last, or the effect of wars last much longer than the war itself. i.e., a war can go on for 6, 7, 5, 10 years. But the displacements of people and the fragmentation of families and societal units, they become much greater, and they would impact and go beyond just the immediate region, and it becomes a global crisis. The recent war in Syria has affected and changed the profile of some of the European cities. And a great many Syrians have not yet been adequately housed, and that problem continues. And they will sort of contribute to this ever-growing fringes of society. There are refugee camps, and refugee camps, by definition, are meant to be a temporary measure to we, as human societies, find solutions for those who've been hit by wars. But you could see that there are some refugee camps that have been going on for 60, 70 years almost. So they almost become permanent camps. In effect, there are cities of their own, but they're just not functioning in a way that you would want a city to function. So you can see that all the issues related to social living, to bringing up a healthy and functioning sort of community and family, gets severely compromised by the inadequacies or the lack of planning and structure and infrastructure for these people. I'm sorry, it's a little bit heavy for this hour of the evening, but I try to keep it as light as possible. So the slums and refugee camps, in fact, are by and large unregulated. And they constitute an unhealthy living and working environment. Again, this is an impact on our cities. But I think the human cost associated with that is, I think, far greater. So the pandemic has exposed an issue, and that is that the quality of governance and the scale of inequalities in our global cities have been identified. In a sense that COVID-19 has hit the most vulnerable the hardest. I was reading the statistics only yesterday, unfortunately. I first talked about this subject, I think, a couple of months ago, and just to give you a picture of ever-changing nature of this topic, Africa was not as affected as it is now, and neither was India. Both continents, or subcontinents, are now greatly affected, as unfortunately was predicted by many commentators. And a great deal of that reason is because of poverty. Once you need feeding, you need jobs. So isolation in a leafy suburb is not an option for many people. I just want to point out that almost out of 8 billion of the world population, over 1 billion of them live in slums. And that's a very uncomfortable statistics, I'm afraid. There is connectivity. We need connectivity. I'm sitting in my living room and talking to you, and you're probably doing the same. So the social and the professional need for connectivity is one thing. But what COVID has demonstrated is that we're interconnected more than ever, and that at the same time, the disease sort of both takes advantage of that connectivity, if you like. We're talking about city densities. On the other hand, it doesn't discriminate between the rich or the poor. And the planet is linked through many strands, and one affected part could infect and compromise everyone else. Again, another statistic is that around 95% of people with COVID-19 live in urban areas. And the pandemic has changed, at least temporarily, the nature of our cities. Again, we all need to just look outside or on our way to work if we do go to work, or if we're still isolating. But in the sense that the social impact on our healthcare and our way of life, but economically we are being affected. So in terms of getting, the way we use our social spaces or public spaces, and the way we see that in many countries, in fact, the digital system or the digital infrastructure is strained under the pressure. But the other effect is, in fact, the isolation for many people creates mental health issues. A lot of old people, unfortunately, some are severely affected by COVID itself, but some are actually suffering mental health and to their own detriment because they are isolated. They cannot see families, they cannot really interact, and that has affected them severely. I think yesterday was announced a vaccine could be found, but yet it needs to be tested. So in the absence of a vaccine, some of these disruptions could become permanent. Now, there are elements of our sort of everyday life that has also been affected. I think you see people increasingly refusing to handle cash, so the retail is being increasingly digitalized. Again, in another talk that we do at LWK, we look at the ever-changing sort of physical nature of retail in the way the shopping malls, which particularly in the Middle East and also in China, are great centers of social interaction. Now they are changing in their character, because if the shops are not functioning, or people are not going to shop, so what is the incentive for a retail center or a mall to stay open? And if they don't, let's say in cities where there's huge investments, malls are being made, then what of them? What do we do with this extremely expensively built and very expensively run mega structures? So there is a need for a response for some adaptive use. But the other thing is the fact that increasingly people are shifting to remote working conditions, and some have realized that they actually quite like it. They find that they have more time because of the commuting. They can have more flexible time, and sometimes their working hours are extended, but it's done on their terms, and it suits them. So then what happens to the offices, etc.? I mean, I could go on. There's many factors in terms of lifestyles, but again, day before yesterday, it was announced that the City of London, now that it has experienced reduced traffic, is seriously, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is thinking about increasing the pedestrianized zones within London, i.e. no car areas. For a dense old city like London, this could be good news. But invariably, this will have an impact on the retail and the infrastructure of the city as we know it. Again, the fact that we're able through technology to talk to each other from different parts of the world not only has an effect on our physical environment, i.e. we can function and work effectively from our houses, but also the need for travel is reduced. Again, for the past 15, 20 years, I've been fortunate enough to travel great distances, attending meetings, attending building sites, etc. But on the other hand, that has it has impacted the environment, it has impacted on me as a person, etc. Or those who travel are affected by that. And now we'll see that review, that reassessment of the lifestyle is becoming an option. So whilst it's impossible to predict what the new norm or normal will be, could it be that we will be experiencing a reverse urbanization? All of a sudden, a remote cottage in a leafy suburb or even in the heart of the countryside anywhere in the world is an option for many, because very active, dynamic professionals always wanted to be in the center of cities because that was where the jobs were. But, with all the technologies available, why? And then if that is an option, then what happens to cities as we know them? Cities are amazing places. And they're robust. They're extremely cunning, and they reinvent themselves. Because human beings reinvent them and recreate them, and the need again for social interaction and bold, beautiful urban settings. It goes with us, with our psychological and our most inner desires. So cities will come back stronger, but when they do, will it be driven by a new model or growth that emphasizes inclusivity, sustainability, and economic opportunities? I hope so, although there's no guarantee. Or will we go back to our old habits and just run to next meeting and run to the next appointment? But I'm positive in the sense that I see opportunities here. There'll be opportunities for urbanists, planners, entrepreneurs to build back better, exploring ways to upgrade their zoning, promote smart density and greener investments. I think even before the crisis, urban communities around the world were demanding lower costs of living and stronger plans to tackle climate change. Some unaffordable cities such as New York were even seeing residents leave town. I think London has been experiencing the same thing. But you may recall in Hong Kong about a year ago when people were coming out in the tens of thousands. And by many analysts, the root cause of that was in fact expensive rental and living conditions. So whilst there is a need for change, maybe COVID could be that agent of change. we need to develop best practices for protecting population health and the rights for the cities, which will help keep urban environments attractive. Again, that there are many means and methods that could be used and employed to do that. But I think initially the thoughts and the willingness and the awareness of our cities and our urban environments and the quality, the need for a better quality has got to be there. And we need to observe it and we need to demand it. The eternal optimist. That's me, sometimes. Again, as an urbanist and an architect, as urbanist architects and developers, politicians and citizens, we need to curate a better reality. And by that, I mean that we need to be aware that the quality of our lives, the quality of our future generations depend on our actions and our thoughts and our appreciation of what matters, what really matters. And again, I won't go to what doesn't matter. And I'd like to thank you all very much for staying up and listening. And I'll be glad if you have any questions you'd like to ask, or you'd like to go to bed now. Thank you.
It's not really too late yet, but
isn't it?
It's
oh,
fine.
right. Okay,
No.
it depends which parts of the region you're from.
Even in Dubai.
Okay. Yeah, okay, fine.
Okay, so we still didn't receive the questions. I just told everyone to send the question. But we have here Dr. Abir, who is here with us. Dr. Abir.
أيوة. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abir.
Thank you very much for your nice talk and presentation. You touched upon mostly the main points that are under debate now in regarding post-COVID cities and urban situation. You mentioned that this pandemic is kind of an opportunity to change. But I wonder, it's an opportunity for whom? Is it for governments or it's for the people themselves? Because if we look into the history of previous pandemics, most of the responses were basically physical. They, for example, the one you mentioned in London, the 1666 fire, new building codes emerged and the new building materials had to be followed, and sanitary system after cholera, and so on. But now the situation is different. It has two layers in terms of the urban environment. It has a physical layer, which can be regulated by top-down regulations from the government, and it has a social dimension, a social layer. That the one that is which constitute an opportunity is the first one, is the regulations done, enacted by the governments to change. So for them, it's they exploit the moment. It's good opportunity for them to bring new rules and new regulations to be enacted upon people to make a change, justify the change for them. But do people accept such regulations, such changes imposed on them? Now, you know, in some countries, they try to open up a little bit, and we feel that people are trying to manipulate the rules that are put down. There is kind of resistance. So if you look into especially the Arab countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all these countries, you feel that people are resisting the temporary regulations. Now, if the pandemic continues for like 1-2 years, maybe the social change will be impulsory. But if it goes only for a temporary period, people will not accept these changes. They need to continue the way that they feel it's normal. There is nothing called a new normal. Now, everywhere you keep hearing about the new normal, there is nothing called a new normal for the people. New normal is only for the government. So if you compare now between this new imposed social behavior and the normal social behavior, people will always prefer to go to their normal daily life and normal behavior, not the imposed one. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Abir, you made very good and profound points. I'm not sure if you asked a question, but that's fine. I enjoyed listening to you. I agree with you on many points, but on the other hand, look, I said that cities or functioning cities need and want good governance. So good governance or responsible and responsive government is a must. But that's only one component. I think the awareness of people, and I kept maybe a few slides sort of referring to us as citizens demanding. But before we demand, we need to be aware. We need to invest personal time and effort in seeing what adds to the quality of our lives. I think there is a interrelated sort of relationship that exists, should exist between people and their governments. And I appreciate that there are some parts, regions of the world where both in terms of awareness, there might be a lack of, but also in terms of good governance, responsive governance that are truly representative of the population, that also could be an issue. So, but nevertheless, I think, and as a Middle Eastern, I feel that it comes a time that I'm an urbanist, and I can propose, and I'm an academic, and I can teach. As a practitioner, I can remind my clients, but I think ultimately, as a citizen, every one of us has the ability to ask, for instance, that my neighborhood, I have, 400 kids, boys, girls, and there's not one single playground there. And it's to identify the real needs of our cities and just small demands. And I think that the engagement at the local level, it's a must. I mean, if we're going to change anything about our cities, it needs to come from the people themselves. So when you say people are actively resisting change, then the question's got to be asked of the people themselves. What is it that you're resisting? What is it that's so inherently difficult for you to understand that the safety of your community and your family depends, by and large, quite often, on our own behavior? And I think, again, particularly in the Middle East, and I say that as a Middle Eastern, we need to expect a lot more from our populace than we do. I know that we can, and we should be demanding more from our governments, but I think there is a lot of self-education that needs to take place as well. I don't know if I answered it was a correct response to what you were saying, but I agree with you. But at the same time, I want us, all of us, as stakeholders, as citizens, it's no longer to say, well, my government doesn't care, therefore I'm going to throw rubbish in my street.
No. What I meant is that the regulations that are related or associated with the COVID-19, like social distancing, not going into crowds, such things. People are resisting these things, but not in terms of upgrading the quality of the built environment itself and their lifestyle.
Great. Yes. No, I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think COVID is highlighting something that's been going on for decades. And the other thing that I often point out is that look, urbanism, although it's building cities has been with us since the beginning of time, but urbanism as a debate, as a practice, really as a formal education, it's only been with us, less than a few decades. And in that sense, that we are sort of becoming more aware of our built environments. The fact that we're staying up, people like yourselves and every single one of us, and we'll see that the components of a city. Again, I trained initially as an architect, and never in my, dare I say, 10, 15 years of beginning of my career, did anyone refer to the city as a context. And it's only by default that I got involved in a project that then I felt there was something missing, and I started studying urbanism, that the word's context and a city that was responsive, not just a building that was an extrusion, isolated extrusion. And I think that change in perception is positive, and we just need to nurture that debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another voice question from Lubna, and we have about 3 written questions we will take. Lubna?
Hello, and thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Actually, I might call them thoughts rather than a question. The first thought is why we are always talking about the lifestyle and the social life. While we are doing this, we are addressing a certain layer of the social or of the society. We are not actually addressing the whole society. Because if we are addressing the whole society, then when we are stating this ratio that 69% of the infected people are living in urban areas, we have to say that 70% or more from these 70 up to 80% from these infections happens in high density poor areas.
Yes, we said
Actually, most of the infected areas and the areas that districts put into under quarantine in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and in most of the countries, it was a very poor areas.
Yes.
The inhabitants of these areas they don't have a lifestyle that we are talking about. They don't have this luxuries of discussing the 1.5 meter between each other. This is the new normal is not existing because their dream is to reach the normal, the one we used to have without questioning. I hope we as a researcher, as a scholars, as urbanists, as socialists, personally, I am an associate professor, I am an architect and urbanist, and I can claim that I feel it's my own responsibility to raise the discussion for these people. These people are the really got more infected. These people are really who was dramatically affected by the consequences of economical consequences. These people actually was the people couldn't stay at home to be safe, because if they stayed at home, they will die from hunger.
Yes, yes.
And the other thing, even the other thing is regarding even the equity for having access to the internet and for communication. Because
Yes.
even if you are discussing having application, which happened in many countries like Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, having applications that you can use it to know if this area you are staying in with high infections or no. They don't have this luxury in their life.
Yes.
It was just thoughts, and I thought to share it with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lubna. I really appreciate. Look, this is the second time I've done this talk regarding urban response to COVID. Something that I think if you go back to my talk, or if you should ever be unfortunate enough to attend my next talk, you'll see that over 50% of my slides is actually pointing out to this very factor, in a sense that we have almost, the privileged 5% of the world population that has access to over 50% of the world's resources almost have no right to sort of address some of the issues, because the vast majority of people, like I said, and this is not excluding for a minute, and they shouldn't be excluded, but even not counting the 1 billion slum dwellers, refugee camps, those who are not really have or they're homeless, if you like, because they don't have a definite address. Even if you for a minute exclude them, then the world's poor are still a significant proportion of the world's population, and I said both in India and in Africa, death rate is rising. But even in the first sort of an advanced economy like the UK, a lot of the cities with poor migrant communities, and these migrant communities could be second or third generation migrants, but because they are still poor, the COVID-19 has affected them more than the affluent urbanites. So I'm aware, and I make every opportunity I get, I hope, I'll become a voice for those people, exactly like you said. And so I agree with you.
Thank you very much. And I look for your other presentation. It will be my pleasure to see them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lubna. Thank you. Okay, we have a few questions. I will read them for you. It is actually 2 questions. One from Petal. The question is, social distancing is changing how real estate and profitability will be measured by developers. Do you think urban regulations will have to be brought into place to ensure that best practices are followed?
No, because I don't think it's a sort of such an immediate and direct correlation that we cannot all of a sudden begin to sort of say, there's a 50-story residential tower, let's say somewhere in some metropolis, let's say Mumbai, and then there are 450 apartments there. Of those 450 apartments, only a certain percentage can be occupied. It's like how they do them in restaurants these days. I'm being a little bit facetious or flippant to make a point. So if you just bear with me a second. So I don't think that urban regulations can do something about a pandemic that it will end. The pandemic will end. The creativity, the will that exists within human societies will get rid of it. Unfortunately, it might take longer than we any of us had hoped, but it will go. But it won't be the last pandemic. But the next pandemic could be something unrelated to social distancing. So you don't change the infrastructure of your cities based on something that is fairly transient. But nevertheless, I think like what the talk highlighted, that there are issues because we've had time to reflect and reevaluate the way we were going on about our lives. I think there are people in this world, and believe me, they're not necessarily part of the very wealthiest, but nevertheless, they had to travel sometimes to the other side of the world, or the other side of their own country for work, and sometimes they had to do it more often than not. And then it became such a pattern of behavior, except a pattern of behavior, that sometimes it didn't actually pay financially, yet it caused families to be away from each other far longer than it was required or healthy. So there is a whole range of opportunities to fundamentally reevaluate, partly because since the Second World War, the pattern of behavior, socioeconomic behavior, and the rapid change, particularly in the advanced economies, has been so high that it has dominated, if you like, and by many standards sort of has undermined some of the better traditional ways of life. Again, becomes a bigger subject, much sort of beyond the tolerance of this little forum. But and that's another subject. But I think that period to reflect, and I mean that people actually sort of think about it seriously. That says, does it even make financial sense, let alone anything else, to be traveling as often as we do, getting on the planes, if you're lucky enough to be able to do that, to attend a meeting in another country? Believe me, I've been doing this for the past 20 years, and so anyway, I shan't go any.
No, it's okay. Okay, the last question from Shaima: what main things do you think will be affected by COVID-19 in the future urban expansion of Dubai city?
That's a very, very interesting question. Dubai, it's a unique city, and believe me or not, Dubai. I first sort of came to Dubai for just a visit 25 years ago. And then I've been living here for the past just under, well, let's say 10 years in the UAE. And Dubai has changed. Dubai has changed itself, but it has changed its own global identity and branding. Dubai is started by being a little bit of a fantasy world, in a sense that it was almost the Las Vegas of Middle East, i.e. it was a two-dimensional existence, urban existence. But what has happened, particularly in the UAE, both with the Abu Dhabi as a flourishing city, and again Dubai as a forward-looking, ambitious, what is becoming a metropolis. It's not there yet, but it could soon become one. It has introduced layers upon layers of complexity in terms of its social infrastructure, in terms of nurturing of talent, and I think once there is greater ownership, if you like, by the stakeholders, greater sense of belongings, which they're trying to improve on. And I think Dubai is being looked by the rest of the world, and I know this for a fact, no longer as a little sort of flash in the pan, a sort of come here, whatever, It is a serious proposal in the sense how you actually perceive of a new human habitation and new. So what would COVID do? I think at the moment the economic impact on Dubai has been huge, unfairly bigger than most cities, because Dubai did rely heavily on tourism, and so therefore that's been decimated. But I think that's short term. Dubai will come back, and I think once people and cities sort of fall down, they get up, they dust themselves, and usually they become a lot stronger and more resilient. And I think Dubai would flourish, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the last question, this is from Yusuf. How about these changes will affect the washroom designs and wet areas? Would ADA revise the regulations?
For what?
Okay, let me repeat it. How would these changes will affect the wet areas, washroom designs, etc.? Would ADA revise the regulations?
I think it goes back to the other question. I think certain cities in the world, the qualities are very good, very high. But the standard of hygiene in many cities is extremely poor. I'm not going to mention countries here, it wouldn't be fair. But again, throughout my travels, I've seen again, this goes back by and large to the citizens themselves. The attitude towards hygiene varies from country to country. I think something that COVID has highlighted is, something basics, again, of personal hygiene. It is not a luxury. It is a necessity. And both people and cities will need to take care of that. So I hope that some cities, I mean, again, in the UAE and by and large in this region, we are lucky. But some parts of the world, and some of it is due to poverty, but some of it is genuinely through a lack of care. That standard of hygiene is poor, and I think that could be implemented and improved.
Okay, so actually time is up. Thank you for answering all the questions, and thank you again for the presentation. It was very impressive, actually informative. And thank you everyone who attended with us tonight.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
Good night and best of luck to everybody.
Take care. Good night. Take care. Bye.